Michael Huemer, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
So, you may not know, but Michael Huemer is a professor of philosophy at the University of Colorado Boulder. He has written on such topics as substance dualism, reincarnation, and the topic of today's discussion, ethical intuitionism, a subject on which he literally wrote the book on it. So that's pretty cool. From the back of the book, we read a defense of ethical intuitionism, where number one, there are objective moral truths. Number two, we know these through an immediate intellectual awareness or intuition. And three, knowing them gives us reasons to act independently of our desires. And I think all three of those claims are fascinating in their own right. And I want to ask you all about them. So I begin with a very simple question. What's ethical intuitionism?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's a view about the nature of ethics, which was popular in the last century, and then it went out of fashion in the last half, and then became more popular again. But okay, so the intuitionists think that there are objective evaluative truths. So these are just truths about what's good, bad, right, or wrong. And by objective, I mean they're independent of the attitudes of observers. There are things that are wrong, and they're not wrong just because you don't like them or you don't want them or something like that. They're just, they're wrong irrespective of how you feel about them, um, and how society feels about them and whatever. And then the other part that gives it its name is that intuitionists think that we become aware of at least some of these truths through something called ethical intuition. Right. So ethical intuition is a kind of direct intellectual awareness of some necessary truth. So the way that I know that pain is bad is I just think about pain, and its badness is self-evident when you think about it. Okay. And then there's another part, which is that we think these truths are irreducible, right? Which basically means that you can't explain ethical truths using non-ethical concepts. Like, you can't explain what good is without using other value terms. You might be able to explain it using other value terms, like maybe good is that which ought to be desired or something like that, but then you have the word ought in there. Right? So the intuitionists think you can't eliminate the value terms. There's no way to explain what value is using non-value terms.
Before diving into the philosophically relevant parts of the conversation, ethical intuitionism isn't the dominant, I suppose it would be a meta-ethical viewpoint. Is that correct? But I know that it's becoming more popular over time. Like, what is the philosophical demographic landscape?
Yeah, so at least in the early to mid century, 20th century, it was very far out of favor. It started to come back, and now, but it's kind of hard to tell because there might be a bunch of philosophers who are not saying what they think. Okay, but so it looked like earlier there were a whole bunch of non-cognitivists, and these are people who think that evaluative statements are not even really factual claims at all. So they're not, they don't have a truth value. They can't be true or false because they're just like expressing some non-cognitive attitude or something like that. So anyway, that it appeared just from looking at the literature that was the dominant view. And I put it that way because that might be an illusion of just the people who talk a lot having that view. Okay. There was a survey. There's a thing called the Phil Papers survey, which surveys philosophers on a whole bunch of different philosophical issues. And it turned out that moral realism is more popular than anti-realism.
I was surprised when I saw that and satisfied because I am a moral realist.
Yeah, yeah. As a matter of fact, like I've heard that a good sign of the truth of a proposition is that the view is more popular than people think it is. So, okay, so like an example is, so, you survey people and you ask, hey, what do you think is the capital of Texas? And what do you think other people would say? Okay, and then you get a bunch of people who say, well, it's Austin, but I think other people would say it's Dallas. Okay, and then that's an indication that it is Austin. Because the fact that they think that other people disagree with them, but they still think this, means that they actually know. They actually know what it is, and they're not just going along with what other people say. Okay, so anyway, and maybe this works in philosophy. I don't know, but anyway, my thought was, yeah. So the moral realists are not just going along with what the other philosophers are saying because they don't know that the other philosophers have this view. Um, yeah, so that's an indication that maybe they have good reasons for it.
I mean, we'll get into this, but I think that moral realism is one of the most obvious truths there is. To me, like I would sooner believe I'm in a simulation than that morality is subjective, that there are no moral truths, to be honest with you. And I wonder, it is encouraging that philosophers apparently have this as a majority view or a plurality view anyway. So another question just about the view before talking about what objections you might raise to it. There are two claims, as I understand it, or at least two claims that form ethical intuitionism. The first is the metaphysical claim that there are objective moral truths. And then the second is the epistemological claim about how we come to know those truths via intuition. Is it possible for those two views to come apart? I mean, I know conceptually, yes, but are there moral realisms espoused by different people where we come to know these in a way that's not by something that looks like intuition? Because that would seem weird to me.
Yeah, I mean, well, there are attempts to well, there are attempts to defend it. I guess I'm putting that tendentiously because I don't think they succeeded. But anyway, yeah, there. So, and in fact, this might be the dominant form of moral realism. They call it ethical naturalism, and these are the people who think that you can reduce value facts to descriptive facts. Okay, and usually the motivation behind that is that they want to eliminate the reliance on intuition. Right. So, okay, so like this is not a popular view, but just as an example, like somebody might say, you know what, goodness is really just the property of causing pleasure. So there are facts about goodness, and there's an objective fact that something causes pleasure or something. So there are objective evaluative facts. Okay. And then you're like, oh, and so how do you know about what's good and bad? And they say, well, like I know it empirically. Okay. And it's like this is a particularly naive thing to think. But anyway, you might think, oh, well, like you can know empirically what causes pleasure. So, like, we'll just do some experiments and see what things cause pleasure for people, maybe for other animals too, right? And then we'll just know on the basis of observation that those things are good, right? And so, okay,
Yeah.
you can think about what's wrong with that. But,
Feels like a sleight of hand.
yeah,
This is a tangent, but are you aware of Sam Harris?
of course, yeah,
Yes.
I like
Yeah.
Sanders.
Yeah. Would you categorize that as his view? I mean, looking at the
Yeah,
moral
yeah,
landscape, that seems to be what he says. He kind of just defines good as pleasure and then says, see, we can investigate it empirically.
I think that's right. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
that is his view. Yeah, and I think that he's not really aware of the objections
No,
that are in the philosophy literature. So,
no, I think he
um,
has a solid footnote where he says, there are ethicists and philosophers that have been talking about this, but I'm going to ignore them. It's like, okay.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I guess, and I'm one of those people that he's ignoring. I guess.
I know, well,
Um,
same. Okay, so that is how they might come apart. But ethical naturalism, especially of that kind, is that what philosophers mean though when they talk about moral realism? Because I was under the impression that a moral realist view is going to be more robust than that. I mean, where it won't reduce moral properties to something else. It will say that there are these moral truths and they exist objectively, but that
mhm.
they wouldn't derive or just be nothing other than descriptive facts. I don't know. I thought moral realism was by its
Well,
nature something stronger.
yeah. I mean, you might think, oh, does this deserve to be called realism? It's not. It's not robust enough. I mean, sometimes people talk about robust moral realism, as opposed to whatever the weaker moral realism. But yeah, naturalism is considered a form of realism because they are saying the evaluative truths are objective. It's independent of what you believe or want or what you feel or whatever, and it's not determined by conventions of society or anything like that. So now you can wonder if this is then is this the important distinction to make between realism and anti-realism? And at one point in my book in Ethical Intuitionism, I say actually the most fundamental distinction is between intuitionism on the one hand and all other views on the other hand, because because it's only the intuitionists that have a fundamentally different ontology. Like every other view holds that there are really only descriptive facts. and these other views differ from each other semantically. And the intuitionist view differs ontologically from everyone else. They're the only ones who think that there's another class of facts, right? Okay. And now, when I say that the other views differ semantically, um, what I mean is, like, they differ about, so they sort of agree on what the fundamental facts are, and then they differ about what those facts make true. Like, okay, so there are facts about what actions cause pleasure or pain for people, and then there's a disagreement about whether those facts that everyone agrees exist make it true that stealing is wrong, right? Or whether they make it so that stealing is wrong is appropriately said but not true, or whatever, or whether it's neither true nor false, or whether it's false or whatever. So they disagree about the mapping between the underlying basic facts and reality. Okay. But it's only the intuitionists who disagree with everyone else about what the most fundamental facts are that exist.
So that intuitionist claim that still concerns the metaphysics of the view, which is good, and I want to continue to ask about that. What is a non-natural fact on this view? What does that mean? What are moral facts ontologically?
Yeah. So, like, we don't really know what the word natural means. There's a lot of use of the word natural in philosophy, and it's hard to say what it means. But actually, that doesn't matter, right? Because in this context, we just mean non-evaluative. So that is, there are, well, you could put it like this: there are facts that could be described using evaluative terms, just like straightforwardly, like the fact that something is good. Okay, and then there are the facts that you're stating when you use non-evaluative language. Like, you don't use anything like good, bad, right, wrong, or other things that obviously entail those. Okay, and so then all those other ones we're calling the descriptive facts, or you could call them natural facts. I don't really care, but whether they're natural or not, like, that's not really the distinction that matters, natural or not, right? Because what if there are facts about, what if you're a mind body dualist? So there are facts about the soul, and those are non-natural, I guess. Those would count as descriptive. So, like if you thought that valued facts can be reduced to these facts about the non-natural soul or whatever, then you're a naturalist. Right? Like in the standard taxonomy of metaethical use, right? So it's not like, naturalism is actually not really a very good word for it, right? It should be called descriptivism or something like that,
Okay.
or reductionism, ethical reductionism.
Okay, so it's descriptive versus evaluative views. So yours is that there are fundamentally evaluative facts.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Okay. So then I'm still curious on this view, on the ontological side of ethical intuitionism.
yeah.
What what grounds moral facts? Because at least on a descriptive scheme, you would say, we have these physical objects and we describe them. There we go. The object there is what makes it the case that it has these certain properties. Basically, maybe. But on this view where moral facts are fundamentally evaluative, what makes them true?
Well, what makes descriptive facts true?
Well, there are
Like,
like so that there are say there are these physical objects with these certain descriptive properties. So like there's an
yeah, well,
object there I can see, I can get an idea of like what makes uh,
yeah.
the
I mean,
ball
yeah,
round. There's a round ball. So then like we have these moral facts. What's the thing that
no,
exemplifies
okay,
the
so
moral features?
wait, so let's say there's a round ball. What
Mm.
makes it the case that there's a round ball?
Well, that's you
Uh,
could then you could interpret that question of like what caused the round ball to exist.
yeah, yeah. Well, is that what you mean? What causes evaluative facts? Because nothing causes them, right? And I mean,
But don't you think
so
there's
it's
a
just,
good question here?
it's like,
Like, I may
it's
not be
like,
able to nail you down, but there's got to be a
well,
question here.
yeah, yeah. So I mean, there's something strange, right? So, like, part of what's going on might be that the people who ask this question are just presupposing anti-realism. They're just like rejecting the view. They're just like rejecting my view, right? There are fundamental value to facts, Right? Nothing other than the reality of facts makes the reality of fact. Okay, now like so there, but there's sort of like a bunch of things in the vicinity. Okay, so like murder is wrong. What makes murder wrong? Well, there can in fact be an answer to that. Like life is valuable, and people prefer to continue it. So like that's part of what makes murder wrong. So okay, so there is something that grounds that evaluative fact, the wrong is the murder, but it's other evaluative facts, right? And okay, so then if you ask, well, so what grounds all of the evaluative facts? Oh, well, you can't really do that, right? You could say, oh, what makes life valuable? I don't know. Like sometimes you have enjoyment in life. Okay, what makes enjoyment valuable? I'm not going to be able to go beyond that. Right?
So there will just be these fundamental moral facts that we bottom out with, kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and this is similar to descriptive or physical facts. Like sometimes there is an explanation of what makes a physical fact the case. So, oh, what made it the case that there's a round ball? Well, you could start talking about atomic theory and like how the atoms that are in the ball are bonded together to make it solid, to give it a a fixed structure or whatever, and like that made it a ball. Okay. But then if you ask, okay, but what made the atoms exist? Oh, all right, well, there were these subatomic particles. Okay, what made the subatomic particles exist? There's no answer to that. It just is that way.
Mm. Okay, so there are two viewpoints that might help clarify the viewpoint that you're espousing, even though I think I'm getting it. So you might be a Platonist and you might say that moral values are abstract objects. And so to my mind, that gives me some idea of like what grounds the relevant moral truths about moral values anyway. They are these abstract objects, timeless and spaceless, necessarily existent. And you might reject the Platonist metaphysics anyway, but at least I can understand how that account gives a grounding of these truths. Or you might be an advocate of theistic metaethics, and you would say that fundamental moral facts about value are grounded in God's character. I'm not trying to like winnow you down into refuting theistic metaethics, but I can understand the viewpoint, and I can say, okay, well, that does provide an answer to like, even if I reject it, what grounds these facts? Okay, it's a fundamental, concrete being, God's character. So I gather that on your viewpoint, there just is no fundamental grounding thing. There are just these facts that obtain. Is that
Well, yes, but I guess I should explain more. So, like, when people try to ground ethics on religion or God, they don't notice that they're not really providing a grounding for ethics, right? So, like, oh, okay, well, why is adultery wrong? Oh, because God said it was wrong. But there's always like another question. When somebody tries to explain why some moral fact obtains, there's going to be another question that's left over that's of the same form. Okay, so like, oh, but why do we have to obey God? And then it can't really answer that by saying, well, because God said you have to obey him. Because that's circular, right?
well? It's funny. That
So
is what William Lane Craig says in the
okay, yeah,
debate book you contributed to. So I know you're aware of that, but that is what he says. And even as I read
yeah,
that several years ago, I thought, I don't know about
yeah,
that.
yeah. But that doesn't seem good. But anyway, okay, but it's not just um, theistic ethics. It's just like any theory where you try to ground ethics. Well, you're either going to give an explanation that just doesn't work; it just doesn't explain the thing, or you're going to have some other thing that we could ask for the explanation of it until you get to the point where you admit that that's just a fundamental fact. Okay. Now you mentioned Platonism, and I am a Platonist, and I have many controversial views, and I regard many of my controversial views as trivially true. So that
That's
is
the
one of
best way
them.
to be.
It's Platonism is trivially true, although it's also highly controversial. Okay. Anyway, and how does it relate? Well, like, okay, there are abstract objects which exist necessarily, and there are facts about them, about how they relate to each other or the properties that some of these abstract objects have. So, like, the number two is even. Okay, and so like that's a timeless necessary truth. Where does it come from? It doesn't come from anywhere, right? Because it's timeless and necessary. Okay, and so just like with every other universal, okay, so like two is a universal. Um, just like with every other universal, well, there are abstract necessary truths about value, about goodness and badness, and so on, right? So like pain is bad. Well, so that's about, there's the universal pain, or painfulness of the property, and then there's the universal goodness, and they stand in a certain relation to each other necessarily, right? Which is similar to how, like, two-ness and evenness stand in this relation to each other necessarily.
Okay, so that would be something of a metaphysical grounding for moral truths.
Yeah, I mean, like, I think this is just sort of like a description of any like any general abstract truth, right?
If you're a
Like,
Platonist.
yeah, yeah, which as we've discussed is trivially true. So
Right, I'll see. So, okay, that is helpful, and I don't have any real concerns about moral realism itself. I think it's true,
yeah,
and I think any objections I would raise or want to get your answers to would be more properly to the epistemology behind ethical intuitionism. So,
yeah,
that second feature of intuitionism is that we know these moral truths via intuition. So, in the most succinct way you can, what is it to know a truth via intuition? What does intuition mean here? Because that's a word that's thrown around in philosophy as well as popular culture, and it means a variety of different things. So, what does it mean here?
yeah, yeah. So it's good to know that in philosophy, intuition is used as something of a technical term. It's not to be taken as just like whatever the ordinary colloquial use of intuition in ordinary language. Um, so in my account, intuitions are a type of appearance. They're initial intellectual appearances. Okay, what are appearances? Appearances are a type of mental state that you have that you're reporting, I claim, when you say that something seems to you to be the case or appears to be the case. There are many different kinds of appearances. So there are sensory appearances, like you see the table in front of you and you have an appearance of the table, like it appears there's a table. It looks like a table. It seems like there's a table. Okay. There are memory appearances, like, I seem to remember eating breakfast this morning. So you're going to have this like experiential memory. Okay, that's an appearance. Um, Appearances are not necessarily tied to the actual fact. So you could have the appearance of having um, eaten a pancake and be wrong. You could have misremembered or whatever. Okay. Um, and so there's sensory appearances, memory appearances, and that there are intellectual appearances. And these happen when you think about something and the thing just seems to you to be true. So I think about, the shortest path between any 2 points is a straight line, and that just seems to me like that has to be true. Right, so that's an intellectual appearance. In fact, there are two kinds of intellectual appearances. There's inferential and intuitive intellectual appearances. Right, the inferential appearance is where you consider a certain fact, and then you consider another proposition in the light of that fact, and it seems like the second thing has to be true in light of the first one. All right, so now, okay, I should have thought of a good example of this, but anyway, that's the basis for making inferences. So if you believe A and you believe if A then B, then you're just going to have the inferential appearance that in the light of those two facts, B has to be true. All right. So, and then the contrast to an inferential appearance, the other kind of intellectual appearance is where you just think about B by itself and it just seems to you like it has to be true. Okay. So the um, non inferential intellectual appearances, those are intuitions. Okay. Now, ethical intuitions are just intuitions that you have when you're thinking about ethics. So these would be you think about some action maybe and just seems to you like it would be wrong. Or you think about some state of affairs and it just seems good to you. So that's an ethical intuition.
Okay. And on your view, are intuitions self evident? Because I know, just like intuition, self evidence is a technical term in this context.
Yeah, yeah. It depends on what you mean by self evident. Right.
Naturally.
So I kind of feel like that term is more confusing than helpful because um, I just think that people have a bunch of associations. Like they have different properties in mind that people are just jumbling together. So, okay, so one of the things that people have in mind when they say self evident is non inferentially justified. So it's justified and it doesn't require an argument for it. Justified in a way that doesn't require reasons. Okay. But then another thing that people sometimes have in mind is, like they think self evident propositions must be incorrigible. Like it's impossible to have a basis for correcting it, or for changing it. And it appears to me that people are just confuse those two properties with each other. Those are completely different. Right? Like the claim that I don't need an argument for something is completely different from the claim that I can't have an argument against it. Right? But anyway, people confuse those two together. And then along with that is the idea that the self-evident things are absolutely certain, right? Like probability one. Okay. So anyway, so what about intuitions? Well, they're non-inferentially justified. So if something seems to you to be the case non-inferentially, it makes sense. You're justified in believing it's reasonable to believe that it is the case unless you have a reason for doubting it. I'm not saying that it's impossible to acquire reasons for doubting it. I'm just saying until you acquire reasons for doubting it, it's reasonable to believe it, right? So then you can figure out whether that counts as being self-evident.
I see. So the self-evidence speaks to the non-inferential justification of the belief in question.
Yeah.
Okay. So to ask more about the epistemology of the viewpoint, how do we have access to moral facts? Is there any special way in which we come to know moral facts? Because, I mean, you might say, well, it's not a real relevant issue, but I could see how some philosophers would say that this access seems mysterious. These are fundamentally, I suppose non-natural isn't helpful, but evaluative facts that might exist platonically in some sense. But how do we come to know them other than just reasserting this intellectual seeming? Like, how do we have this capacity?
Well, I was going to just reassert things.
I thought you might.
You think about it and it becomes obvious.
Okay.
So how do you know that 2 is more than 1? Like the answer is kind of, in a common sense, the answer is because I understand what 2 is, and I understand what 1 is. and if you understand that, then you're just going to see that 2 is more than 1. Okay, how do you know that pain is bad? Well, I felt some pains. I know what pain is like, and it was bad. Okay. Now, like there could be sort of further philosophical questions in the vicinity. Like you might think you have reasons why you shouldn't be able to know that, right? And if you have specific reasons why you think you shouldn't be able to know that, then we could address that. Okay. So like sometimes people say, well, but there's no causal interaction. So like these are abstract facts about relations between abstract objects, and abstract objects don't have causal powers on concrete objects. And like my brain is a concrete particular object, it's not affected by abstract objects. Okay.
That's where I was going to go. So you preempted me.
Oh, good. Okay. Yeah. And now, I don't exactly know. I don't exactly know what the answer to this is, but I want to point out that this is not like something that's particularly about ethics, right? This is not a challenge for ethics. This is a challenge for knowledge of any abstract truth. And you probably don't want to say that you can't know any abstract truth. So like, numbers don't have causal powers. Like numbers are abstract objects. They don't have causal powers. They don't like move things around in your brain. So how could you have knowledge of them? Right. And so, well, it appears that then it just is not a requirement for you to know about something that it causally interacts with you. Right? And so like, sort of when you're talking about the nature of ethics, that's not a good time to talk about general skeptical arguments that have a wide sweep beyond ethics, right? Like when you're thinking about the nature of value, you should think about problems that are allegedly specific to value.
I think that's fair. It does seem that objection generalizes to really just a objection to Platonism itself, to that metaphysical account of abstract truth, as you say. So in that respect, it has no special purchase against ethical intuitionism.
Yeah. And by the way, like, there's some other things like, so like if you had a very simple view about knowledge and causation, that to know something, you have to interact with it. That means that you can't know anything about the future. That means probably like you can't know anything by induction.
Shoot.
So like,
that's bad.
right? Like, because with induction, you observe a sample and then you draw a generalization,
Mm,
but your belief is not caused by the generalization; it's only caused by the sample. Right? So,
mm.
like, if your belief has to be caused by the fact that makes it true, then you couldn't know the generalization.
Those are good points. Those are good points. So that helps address that first objection. I'll give you that. Got no powerful counter reply. So what about the fact of moral disagreement as
Yeah,
probably an objection to the epistemological side of intuitionism, but maybe the moral realism, that it would seem that lots and lots of people disagree about what is the moral truth. And so that might call into question the reliability of the process by which they come to know moral truth. And I just
yeah,
take it
yeah,
as given that there is substantial moral disagreement. We could disagree about the extent of it, but
yeah,
think of just the
yeah.
political arena in the United States. There's quite pronounced disagreement about a range of ethically relevant issues. What accounts for that on the
Yeah,
ethical intuitionist view? Why is that disagreement not good reason to think that even if there is ethical truth, we don't really have good access to it?
yeah. I mean, sometimes you should conclude that you don't that you don't know the truth, right? So, like people are way overconfident in their political beliefs, as you sort of alluded to there. So yeah, like no, if half the country disagrees with you strongly, then you shouldn't be super confident, right? Like I don't know, there could be exceptions. Like there could be cases where I guess half the country is being stupid, but anyway, but like if this happens over and over again, you should start to think there's something about this area that people have a hard time. Okay, um, should you then become a moral skeptic in general? Well, what you could do is you could distinguish the things that people agree about from the things that people disagree about. And you should lower your confidence in your beliefs about the things that people disagree about. But you don't have to lower your confidence in the beliefs that people agree about. Okay. And it just happens that the things that people disagree about get way more attention than the things that they agree about. So like we're not, there are policy debates, but there's no policy debate about like what should our policy be about murder? Like should we have murder or no murder? And like nobody thinks we should repeal the murder statutes. um, so okay, but that's why we don't talk about that because we don't talk about that. It's like we don't notice that there's substantial agreement, right? Another thing I wanted to say was that actually we have increasing convergence over time. So um, it's like thousands of years ago, people used to have different values from the values that we have today in a lot of important respects. Okay, but like across the millennia and especially the last, I don't know, couple of centuries, there's been a sort of like convergence towards a broadly Western liberal values system. Okay, so like an example is that slavery used to be very widely practiced across history, and then it started to be abolished in the 1800s. And then there's a remarkable convergence. It is now illegal in every country in the world. Okay, so you just see this sort of like sweeping across the globe. Okay, so it's interesting, right? And there's other examples that are like that. Okay, like women used to not be allowed to vote. And then this sort of women's suffrage movement started to spread. And now, today, women can vote in every country where anyone can vote. Right? Not every country is democratic, okay, but also democracy is spreading across the world. It used to be that there were no democracies, and then it's like now, like half the world is democratic, and it looks like it's going to spread. It looks like one day the whole world will be democratic. Okay, so then actually, there was this argument from disagreement that maybe there aren't any moral facts because people can't agree, but actually, you know, maybe the evidence is the opposite. Like because people are increasingly agreeing, maybe that's evidence that there are objective facts, right? And by the way, notice that in other areas, like in all of the other sciences, people started out disagreeing and just like having wildly inaccurate views. And if you look at the history of science, you notice that there's just like all of these theories that are wrong. But then over time, there's convergence towards better and better theories.
But in the case of the sciences, the claim was never that we know the truth of scientific theories via intuition. And so I wonder if that raises special problems for just accommodating disagreement across time because, ancient human beings presumably had the same cognitive faculties. And so unless you want to say that their access to the relevant intuitions was different, then what accounts for their inability to grasp what we today would count as fundamental moral truths?
Yeah, I mean, why wouldn't that argument apply to all areas of inquiry,
The,
right? They had the same capacities that we have. So, but they were wrong about everything else also. They were wrong about almost everything, right?
well, but there's a claim in ethical intuitionism that we apprehend these things immediately through intuition, whereas in the case of scientific theories, it takes a long chain of inferential reasoning to get there. And as long as you don't think that human reasoning is 100% reliable, well, if you keep multiplying the number of inferences, you're going to get a situation where it's not at
Yeah.
all unlikely that the chain would go wrong somewhere. And you need empirical
Yeah.
data and you need observations. Those aren't things you can just create by thinking about them. So there does seem to be a special issue.
Well, so a couple of things. Like, I mean, one, intuitionists don't claim that there's no reasoning in ethics, right?
Hmm.
Um, so, like, we're not against reasoning, but we do think that reasoning has to start somewhere, which almost everyone else also agrees with. Reasoning has to start somewhere.
Okay.
Um, okay, but also, like, the reason why people were wrong about almost everything in the history of science wasn't really that there were long chains of reasoning, and then they just made a mistake somewhere in the chain of reasoning. Which, by the way, you would expect somebody else to notice.
Well, but
You know,
to get to the truth requires a long, long chain of inferential reasoning. And so it's going to take time to work through that.
well, okay, there's sort of like a long chain in the history, in our
Hmm.
history. Okay, but like the reason why people had incorrect theories, it wasn't that they went through a long chain of reasoning to arrive at those theories most of the time, right? Okay, so like people used to think that there were four basic elements in the world: earth, air, fire, and water. That was wrong. That's 100% wrong, right? None of those things is an element. Right? It's like, okay, there are elements, but none of them is earth, air, fire, or water. Anyway, why did they think that? It wasn't that they went through a long chain of reasoning and they made a mistake along the way. Like, no, they guessed. That's what happened. They guessed that maybe there are four things. Okay. But anyway, like, well, human beings do that a lot. They guess something, and most guesses are wrong. Okay. And like they kind of did that in ethics too, right? They just sort of like guessed, or right, or it may be even worse. Like they said the thing that was in their own interests, right? Like when we said, you know what, slavery is okay. The slave masters were saying that, not the slaves, right? And the slave masters were saying that because it was in their interest to say that.
So
So,
would you say they ignored or downplayed the seemings that they had access to, that this seemed
yeah, I
wrong?
mean, well, they are a lot of the problem, and this is in ethics and philosophy and just and politics. A lot of the problem with people's belief systems is that they're not trying very hard, right? So it's not exactly that they know that it's wrong; they're doing it anyway. It's that they're not thinking hard about whether it was wrong or not. They don't want to know. Right? Like if you've been owning slaves all your life and you have 100 slaves and you actually can't afford to free them because you have all these debts or whatever, um, you don't want to know that it's wrong to hold slaves. And if you don't want to know, you're going to not think about it, right? Because like a lot of the ethical truths that people didn't get are not really hard to see, right? It's just like just like people being stupid, or so like being intentionally stupid.
Mm. So then I suppose you would give the same answer, but what about the perhaps few, but still very real, substantial moral disagreements that exist not within one culture, but between separate cultures today? And perhaps the most vivid example would be female genital mutilation. I assume that there are some cultures that do not have that sense or seeming that this is wrong, whereas most people in Western cultures, when they reflect on it, are horrified by the practice.
Yeah, I think we can say that it's wrong. Like, I don't think that's not a hard one. That's clearly wrong. Um, yeah, and why is that? Well, what happened was that they got messed up by religion, right? Because I think 100%, about 100% of the people who endorse that practice are Muslims, right, or some religion. some religion, but I think they're maybe all Muslims or almost all Muslims. Okay, so what happened was that they believe a religion that is not factually true, right? As a matter of objective fact, it is not true. God did not say any of this stuff. Okay, so like sometimes your moral errors are due to factual errors, right? Although it's not completely clear cut because, like, well, it might be that part of why they hold this religion is also that they have bad values, and they sort of like you sort of like choose the religion partly on the basis of your values. And also people, some like if you don't like some of the value claims of your religion, you might just reject them. Okay, so like like there's stuff in the Bible where I don't know, like it says that you should stone gay people to death for being gay, and virtually no Christian believes that, as far as I know today. There was a time when they did. Okay, but now they just reject it because it's just obviously not true. So that's just obviously wrong. So anyway, okay. So you could say, well, so why don't the Muslims just reject that? Actually, I don't even know if that's in the Quran or in the Hadith, or if they just made that up. So okay, but anyway, so I don't know why they believe this thing about genital mutilation. Um, okay, but you might think, well, why don't they just sense that it's bad and then just reject it? Just like people with other religions will reject the parts of their religion that seem wrong. Um, okay, yeah, I don't know if it's part of their religion. Okay, anyway, but why don't they reject? Yeah, I don't know. Probably they have like emotional reactions. So it's sort of like their emotional reaction is interacting with their religion, and they're sort of like using the religion as an excuse for not reflecting on how it would seem wrong, right? But the reason they want that excuse is that they have this emotional reaction that, like, they don't like the idea of women having sexual pleasure. Like, it makes them uncomfortable. And so they need an excuse for thinking that it's okay to stop women from having that. And then, but then because they believe this religion, then they have an excuse. Okay, anyway, so yeah, there's I'm sort of like psychologizing why people would have incorrect ethical views. Um, but anyway, but like the best explanation is not that there's no fact, right? The best explanation is that human beings have complicated psychology that is not super truth oriented. Like most human beings are not all that strongly oriented towards truth.
That is the case. I think that's a good reply. So I have this quote here that I'm going to throw at you, and I want to get your take. Critics of intuitionism can claim that the fact that there is disagreement between moral philosophers and even between intuitionists themselves undermines the view that certain propositions are self evident. These philosophers will have thought long and hard about the relevant propositions, and, we would hope, have a very clear understanding of them. One would therefore expect that if there were certain moral propositions, the truth of which could be apprehended by intuition, then moral philosophers would converge on these truths. Persistent disagreement amongst reflective, thoughtful, and comprehending moral philosophers may cast doubt on the view that any of these propositions are self evident. Back to you, Michael Huemer.
Yeah, I mean, wait, who is that from?
That's from
Who?
the Stanford Encyclopedia article on ethical intuitionism, the
Okay.
author on that.
Yeah, whoever that is. Okay.
Mhm.
Well, this is really painting with a broad brush, which is one of the problems in meta ethics, that somebody just says ethical truths. Ethical truths aren't self evident because people disagree about ethical truths. What ethical truths are you talking about? Because they're not all the same. There's not just like one proposition or whatever. Okay. So, so there are things that people disagree about, and then there are things that people agree about. So if you're trying to say, like, the things that there's very widespread disagreement about, the highly controversial truths, are not self-evident, and also if by self-evident you mean absolutely certain, then you're right. Okay, but then if you mean even the things that people do agree about, we still don't know because there are other things that they disagree about, that seems like an invalid inference, right? Okay, and like I was mentioning that there's increasing convergence on ethical propositions over time. There's a lot of disagreement in ethics, but virtually everyone in ethics, virtually like every ethicist, has a broadly liberal value system and like agrees with each other on a number of actually really important things where they disagree with people who lived 2,000 years ago. So like I know of no ethicist today who thinks that slavery is just. And that's not a trivial example, because that's actually really important. It's really important to know that it's unjust. Okay. And we've converged on that. We have an agreement on that. And then nobody, like we don't talk about it anymore because everybody knows. Okay. But, if somebody starts saying, oh, there's no agreement in ethics, then it's relevant to bring up examples like that.
So what accounts for the difference between the self-evident ethical truths and the non-self-evident ones? So what accounts for the fact that murder is wrong is agreed upon and self-evident, but healthcare as a universal human right is apparently not self-evident and agreed upon? Like, what would the intuitionists say about to explain the difference there?
I mean, usually it's that there's some further reason why the thing is the case. Yeah, so, well, it could also be because people have different sorts of biases. So there are various reasons why people can go wrong in their ethical judgments, and people use a sort of heuristic that I call the affect heuristic, right, or the attraction aversion heuristic, which is you think about something and then you think about some state of affairs, and if you feel attracted to it, then you conclude that it's good, or if you feel an aversion to it, then you conclude that it's bad. That works a lot, right? Because if you're normal, you're averse to bad things. You'll generally be attracted to good things. However, the degree of your feeling of attraction or aversion is not necessarily proportional to the badness or goodness or badness of the thing. All right, so you can go wrong, and sometimes you could have sort of like self-centered biases. Like the way you feel attracted or averse to something could depend upon your personal interests that in a way that doesn't generalize to other people. Okay, so now now I've kind of like forgotten what prompt started me on talking about that.
Oh, to explaining why certain moral principles are obvious or self-evident and why others there's still
Yeah.
much
So
disagreement about.
yeah,
Murder
murder's
bad, and
wrong.
then healthcare, universal human right.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I was going to say, about healthcare being a right. I mean, there's probably further reasoning behind why that would or wouldn't be a right. And so there's like probably a more complex and more subtle thinking process. But also, it's like, well, it might be that people are saying that because it makes you feel a certain way when you say that, and like some people like it, and then some people don't like it. The libertarian argument for why it's not a universal right is that rights have to be compossible, and there's a negative right against like being forced to work for people or being forced to give your resources or something like that, and then that's just not compossible with positive rights. Okay, but so like it's not like the people who are against that just say, oh, it's just self-evident that there's no such right. Like they give reasons. Okay, but also like if you think that it is a right, you could give arguments for why there's such a right. So like maybe there could be a real utilitarian rationale behind why we have a certain system of rights, and then we could have like some discussion about whether it would be good to have a system in which that counts as a right. Right. Whereas, in the case of murder, there just isn't really any case. There's not any case to be made for allowing murder. Like, there's nobody who thinks that if we changed our system so that that was allowed, then it would be better.
That is true. So there's this sense in which the intuitionist isn't committed to the claim that all moral truths will form the foundation or the bedrock of our inferential chain of reasoning. Some moral truths take a long discursive process to arrive at. It's not like those ones we can just see and apprehend. Rather, there's always going to be reasons that you give that were the justification for that moral belief. Rather, you didn't apprehend it directly. It was, okay, I reflected on this idea of negative rights and positive rights. I saw the conflict. Is that kind of the idea?
Yeah, yeah. And by the way, like, for anyone who wants to, you want to know, like, oh, how could somebody reason, or like, what happens when you disagree? Look at the moral philosophy literature. There's extensive literature in ethics in which people argue about controversial ethical questions, and they don't just emote at each other. They don't just shout at each other, they're wrong, whatever. They give reasons. And by the way, all of the arguments are based on intuitions. although they're not always labeled that way, right? Not everyone uses the word intuition, but all of the arguments in the ethics literature start from premises. None of them has an infinite regress of reasons. And some of them might go in a circle, I guess. Some people might give circular arguments. Anyway, those are bad. The ones that are not circular, they start from somewhere. Okay. And the place that they start from will it be something that seems right to the person, or will it be something that seems wrong to them? It'll be something that seems right. Okay. So then they'll be at least treating it like an intuition, right?
I think that's obviously right. And I myself have made that point, so I'm gratified to hear you make it as well. That seems undeniable. I think also in metaphysics generally, philosophy generally, you can't get away from intuition properly defined. But even that is probably controversial. I'm not sure. I'll briefly ask you the tangential question. In terms of philosophy as a whole, do you think most philosophers would concede that intuitions do ultimately form the bedrock of philosophical method, defined the way that you've defined them?
So
It
I'm going
feels
to guess
controversial. Yeah.
yeah, I'm going to guess that most people would not agree to that. But I don't know, like, what would their alternative view be? Their alternative would probably be, I don't know, right? Right. Their alternative would be that they haven't thought it through. They don't have a position, right? They don't know what the alternative would be to relying on intuitions. Some of them might have some kind of subjectivist theory, or like, oh, maybe we look at the social conventions. Maybe the social conventions make the thing true. I don't think that would be very popular. Um, and then there would be these ethical naturalists who try to argue that, oh, you could have an empirical basis, and some of them claim that it's analogous to scientific theories. There could be moral theories that are justified by inference to the best explanation, like scientific theories or something. Okay, so like there are alternative views that people would defend, but the majority of people who don't like intuitions would not like those alternative theories either. So the main way of not being an intuitionist is not knowing what you think. And there's a reason for that. The reason for that is there is no rational alternative. Right? There's no alternative that when you think it through makes sense. So the people who don't accept it are the people who haven't thought it through.
I like it. I'm gonna run with that forever now, because that validates what I thought before, so it must be true.
Yeah, yeah. Sounds right.
Okay, so the other big objection that does bother me personally and always has is the an evolutionary debunking argument against our moral beliefs.
Yeah.
So, really rough and ready form, the problem is that our cognitive faculties evolved for survivability, rather than to direct us towards truth.
Yeah.
And it may be that some of our beliefs are true, but it would only be incidentally because those beliefs helped us survive. And in some cases, anyway, it's pretty clear why we have the moral beliefs we do, given that we evolved according to the theory of evolution and natural selection. And so, for instance, at least one example that's given is our the heightened moral significance that we attach to family members as opposed to just members of the general population. That seems very morally relevant, that we have certain special obligations to our family members that we don't have to Joe on the street that I just met.
Yeah.
And yet there is an evolutionary explanation for that that's relatively plausible. It's helped us survive, to place preference on our kin rather than just everybody. So let's say
Yeah.
that generalizes, and that all of our moral beliefs can be that our developing these moral beliefs can be explained via these selective pressures, blah, 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 blah. If I learned that, and it does seem at least somewhat plausible given evolution's success at explaining other facets of the human person, that would make me doubt that the moral beliefs I have are true, or at least justified. What do you?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah. If you doubt that they're justified, you should also doubt that they're true. Yeah. Um,
Yeah, or yeah, I guess the difference between doubting moral realism and then just doubting our access to the moral realm. But it would be weird,
oh yeah.
deny one but not the other. Anyway,
Yeah. Well, so sometimes the debunking argument is supposed to show that, well, if there are maybe there are moral facts, but if there are, we just don't know them. We don't know what they are. They're probably not the ones that we believe. Um, and like that example is a good example. Like if you think that your family, uh, the people who coincidentally share a lot of your genes are more important than the people who don't share your genes. It's like, okay, so on the face of it, there's something weird about that when you just think about that abstractly. That's weird. Why would that be? And also, like, other people can say the same thing. They can say that their family is more important than your family, and you're like, why am I special? And then you adopt the belief, oh, like value is agent relative. So actually, my family is more important to me. Their family, okay. But if you just think about that, that is a weird set of facts. It's like way more plausible that you're just biased than that those are the objective facts. Okay. But then the question is like, oh, how much does that generalize? Well, that really doesn't generalize, right? Like, it doesn't generalize to, universalistic cosmopolitan liberal beliefs, right? It exactly doesn't. It's exactly the opposite, right? So that is, this is a good, the debunking approach is a good response to people who have certain moral belief systems. And of course, by its very nature, it's not good against people who have different value systems. Okay, so, and this is related to what I was saying about how values have changed over time. So it used to be like, whatever, in primitive societies, it was considered okay to attack neighboring tribes to conquer them. Actually, that was considered glorious. And the reason why Alexander the Great was that he murdered a lot of people and stole their land, right? And conquered them and forced them to serve him or whatever like that. That was great. And today we would call him like, a colonialist, whatever, evil oppressor. So, okay. So you could explain one of these value systems, but you can't explain both of them. You could explain the ancient value system as being an adaptation because the people who did this conquering activity were more successful in spreading their genes. But if you give that explanation, you can't explain our modern value system where we reject that. Okay, so then the modern value system is probably objectively true. Right? It's the result of overcoming our biases that were instilled by evolution.
You got a good point. Let me press into that a bit more. That do you deny then that there are evolutionary explanations for some of our modern day moral beliefs or our inclination to accept them? You would deny that for some of those there is an evolutionary explanation for that inclination.
Yeah, you can probably still find things. So, I could think an example would be the thought that our species is more important than the other species. There's like an obvious reason why we would have that bias. Maybe we are more important, right? But like, you know, we attribute way more importance to ourselves than we probably objectively have, like compared to the other life forms. Like that's plausible. Probably like a lot of things about things surrounding sexual morality, we probably have a lot of biases about. There's sort of like, particularly these things where like you treat men and women differently. It's like male promiscuity is admired. Promiscuous males are studs, which is a good thing, but promiscuous females are sluts, which is a bad thing. Like that's weird. That's a weird double standard. There's sort of like an obvious evolutionary explanation for that. So yeah, there are biases that we still haven't overcome, you might say.
But take just the most fundamental moral principle we take for granted, that murder is wrong. It doesn't seem at all unlikely to me that there is an evolutionary explanation for that belief. I would imagine that groups of people that believed murder was a-okay really wouldn't make it that long. But but the explanation for you wouldn't
So
call into question this moral belief or make it seem like a bias. Like, why is that?
okay, but as a side point, you said, oh, so groups of people who accepted murder wouldn't last that long. And this appears to be appealing to the group selectionist model of evolution, which is objectively wrong.
Okay.
Like
All right.
the,
Fair.
the correct version of evolutionary psychology is individual selectionist, or more precisely, gene selectionist. Right? That is, selection operates on the individual gene level. It doesn't operate on groups. So, right. And so, the reasoning is, okay, well, suppose it's like, you're in a group that is against murder, but you personally are okay with murder. And so then the other members of your group don't murder you because they're against murder. But if you have an opportunity to profit by murdering one of them, then you do it. Okay. Then you would be more successful. And then your genes would spread in that group. And so then your genes should take over. Right. So that, and it doesn't, and by doing that, you're making the group as a whole less fit to survive, but that doesn't matter. Right. Because your genes are still going to take over the group.
But then they would probably die in the long term. Like that lineage would die out because the group would die out. So then it wouldn't
Yeah.
propagate
Well,
into the
yeah.
future.
I mean, it would have to be pretty severe, right? But okay, like, so here's the thing, like, why isn't everyone an egoist? There's the view in ethics called ethical egoism, right? Where people think that actually the right thing to do is to serve yourself all the time. Okay, so that's an ethical theory, but it's extremely unpopular. And why would that be? Right? Because like we're always hearing in evolutionary psychology, we're always hearing about how selfishness, evolution explains selfishness, right? And these evolutionary psychologists, like, they can't consistently turn around and go, oh no, like, you know, evolution leads to altruism because group selection, whatever, when they explain so many other things, by appeal to the self-interest of that individual organism, right? So, um, anyway, like it seems like if the cause of our moral beliefs lay in genes, then we should be egoists, and almost no one is.
I guess my doubts arise from the fact that group selection does seem plausible to me, but I am not an evolutionary biologist or really know anything at all about biology, so I'll take your word for it. It just seems on the surface right to me that if you might initially have great success propagating your genes if you were uh, an egoist and everyone around you was not. But it does seem right that eventually that society couldn't sustain itself as too many people became egoists and they couldn't work together and it all collapsed. So that there's some level of evolutionary pressure towards, say, altruism of some kind.
Well, okay, so like, if you're, um, I don't know, like if your selfishness is so destructive that it brings down your whole society, then your genes will not propagate. Okay, but if you have, okay, but if you have a lesser degree of selfishness, it doesn't bring down your whole society, then they will propagate. And the thing is, like, you should expect this to happen independently in every society. Right. So you might be thinking, oh, but like your society will be outcompeted by the society that's full of altruists. No, because that society that's full of altruists, it will get infected by an egoist. And then the egoist genes, right? And so like, you might think, oh, competition between societies will make it so that the ones that are more cooperative will survive. But no, every single one of them will be taken over by the egoists if the egoists actually have greater reproductive success within their society. Okay, but now why did that not in fact happen? It's like, not everyone is a psychopath. Like, people are selfish, normal people are selfish, but they're not maximally selfish. So why are normal people not like psychopaths? Yeah, well, basically because if you act too selfish, other people do things to you. Like, other people will punish you. Right? And like, if the rest of your society finds out that you're a psychopath, they will do something about it. Like, they'll throw you in prison. Our society will throw you in prison, but in other societies, they might just kill you or whatever. Right. Okay, but so that's to say that being overly selfish isn't really in your interests, or being overly selfish in a way that's detectable by others is not really in your interest. So in a sense, it's not really selfish.
But wouldn't that provide something of an evolutionary explanation at some level of your relevant moral beliefs that maybe
Yeah.
not like actually in the biological evolutionary sense, but the evolution of culture and society? That's really what explains your moral beliefs to not be super selfish rather than the intuition.
Yeah.
Maybe
Well, yeah. What I guess we have to sort of identify a more specific moral belief that people would have. Um, but so, suppose there's a belief that everybody matters equally, as held by utilitarians, but basically is held by almost all moral philosophers. Some kind of equal consideration of interests. Um, is that evolutionarily beneficial? Well, like, you know, you, you could say that, but then you can't explain why throughout history, like people thought it was okay to attack other societies, attack neighboring tribes, and like kill the men and kidnap the women and kill the children. Um, right, and right, but the other thing, like some of the examples that are most compelling as cases for debunking are cases where when you state the belief, it sounds weird when you think about it. Okay, so like I mentioned, like the double standard where like it's worse for women to be promiscuous than men, and like you can tell this just like as soon as like teenagers figure out that we have this double standard, they notice that there's something weird about it, right? Like everybody can notice there's something weird about that. Okay, but nobody notices something weird about the idea that everyone deserves equal consideration of interests. Like you don't need to explain why that would be the case. You need to explain why it wouldn't be the case. If you think some people deserve more consideration than others, you have to explain what's special about those people. You don't have to explain why there wouldn't be something special.
Okay, I'm satisfied with that one. So the third facet that I do want to ask you about of ethical intuitionism, at least according to the back of your book, is that knowing moral truth gives us reason to act independently of our desires. So before questioning you on that, what does that mean?
Oh, if you know that something is wrong, then you have a reason to not do it. And that reason is independent of your desires, meaning even if you want to do it, you still have a reason to not do it. I'm not saying that the reason to not do it automatically overrides the reason to do it. I'm just saying that you have a reason for doing it, and that so you have a reason for not doing the thing that is wrong. And your having that reason doesn't depend upon your wanting to not do it or something like that, right?
Right.
Yeah, makes
So
sense.
does that third claim just follow automatically from the prior two, moral realism, and then this claim about how we come to know it? Or is this a substantive
Uh,
addition?
I guess not. I mean, like, I don't know if anyone has this view, but I guess you could have the view that there are objective moral facts, but you don't necessarily have reason to do anything about them, right?
Mm,
So, actually, yeah, I think there are people who have this view. So I think there are people who think there are moral facts, but you only have reason to do the morally right thing if you want to do what's right, or if
yeah.
you care about morality. If you care about morality, then you have a reason.
So yeah, okay. So this relates to like the perennial philosophical question of like, why be moral? What would
Yeah,
be the ethical intuitionist answer to that question? Because the issue is that your answer to that can sometimes at least seem circular. It'd be moral because it's the morally right thing to do. So
yeah.
what is the ethical intuitionist answer to the question why be moral?
Yeah. And by the way, I guess I should say that I don't think every intuitionist would answer these questions the same way. So you
Fair
can
enough.
maybe just
Michael Huemer's answer. That's what I
yeah,
want.
yeah. Why be moral? And like this always struck me as like a nonsense question. Like because so why do such and such is a request for a reason for doing such and such. But by saying that something is moral, you're already saying that you have most reason to do that or something like that. I mean, like the thing wouldn't be moral if there wasn't a reason for doing it. So it's sort of like you're asking for a reason for doing something that you've already stipulated that you have reason to do. See what I mean? Like, so there could be a question. Well, why is this particular action morally required? Like that could be a sensible question. But once you've granted that it's morally required, it doesn't really make sense that you're asking like why we should do it.
I forgot to ask you this because I'm curious. This goes back a step to that second aspect of moral intuitionism. But have you studied at any depth Alvin Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism, which is essentially just the debunking argument, but utilized for a particular
Yeah.
theistic end?
Well, I mean, I thought about it a little bit.
Okay,
I
I
mean,
mean, because it's my concerns about what debunks ethical intuitionism, but applied writ large to this claim that unless there's a God supervising the evolutionary process, then kind of all of our beliefs are debunked, including those beliefs that lead us to think evolutionary theory is true.
yeah. So now, I don't know if he answers this or if this objection is just like based on misunderstanding. He was arguing, okay. But anyway, without preface, yeah, my sense is there's a fundamental question of whether you need to have independent reasons for believing that your cognitive faculties are reliable, or whether you get to use them as long as you don't have reasons for thinking that they're unreliable. Okay, so in the first case, if you have to have reasons for thinking that something is reliable before you can rely on it, then I think you're screwed, no matter what other views you have. Because whatever way that you thought that you knew about God, you have to first prove that that thing is reliable before you can use it to know about God. And you're not going to be able to prove it's reliable because there's going to be an infinite regress or a circularity problem, right? Okay, so then you're just not getting any, so you're just going to have to be a skeptic. On the other hand, okay, so like the only other view to not be a skeptic is you get to start by using your cognitive faculties as long as you don't have reasons for thinking they're unreliable or you don't have defeaters, right? So my view in general is that you get to assume that things are the way they appear unless you have reason for doubt, specific reason for doubt. Okay, so if you go with that, then you say, okay, so like I just get to, I'm a naturalist in Plantinga's sense. Like, let's say I don't believe in God. Okay, and then I just get to assume that my cognitive faculties are reliable, so I get to use observation and scientific reasoning, and then I come to the conclusion that evolution is true. And then I don't think that there's an argument from evolution to the claim that our cognitive faculties are unreliable. Right? Because like I think that if your cognitive faculties were unreliable, then they wouldn't be very good at promoting survival and reproduction. Most of them. I do think there's a special case for evaluative beliefs because it's less obvious how evaluative beliefs would promote survival and reproduction, or like how their correctness would help you survive and reproduce as compared to descriptive beliefs. If you have incorrect descriptive beliefs, you're probably not going to do very well in the world, or at least in most cases. Like if you have incorrect beliefs about where predators are located, that is going to interfere with your survival. Right. And I know there's this discussion where I think Plantinga talks about how, oh, you could adjust the beliefs, but also adjust the desires in a way that will make it so that you'll still be adaptive. But let's say that requires like this sort of like weird coincidence of like the belief is adjusted, but the desire is adjusted in a very specific way. But also the change of that desire is going to fuck up the entire rest. It's going to fuck up so many other things. So then you have to adjust everything else. Okay, so like, you know, you have an incorrect, like there's a tiger approaching, but you incorrectly think that it's receding. Okay, and then, so then, you just like stay there and then you're going to get eaten. And then Plantinga might go, oh, but like, what if you decide that you want to be closer to the tiger, but you also think the tiger is in the opposite direction? So then you go the opposite direction from where the tiger is because you're trying to get closer to it and you actually get farther, whatever. Okay. But then Okay, but the problem is then your incorrect belief about what direction you're going is going to mess up everything else that you're doing that is related to directions in space, right? And so then you have to sort of like, it's not actually obvious that you can just change beliefs and desires and have it, have it still be adaptive without having the beliefs be largely accurate. You see what I mean? There's this article by Christopher Stevens, I think, that I read a long time ago that was kind of about this problem. Something. Okay, I've forgotten the title, but anyway.
Oh, I'll look it up. I think I only know the argument from reading Plantinga a few times on it, so I haven't like read the other side. But that was kind of my thought too. Is that yeah, it's easy enough to see how one belief in isolation could be wrong, but still, if adjusted suitably, but still lead to survivability. But when you connect that belief to all of its implications to everything else you would believe and get a whole person and system and belief system, it's much harder to construct one that is fundamentally false but still would lead you to survive. Well, as a unless you have anything else to add on this topic, I have a last curveball question for you, which is that I read that you are a substance dualist. So first, is that true? Okay. Which I think is fascinating because I incline to it as well, but it's usually ensconced in a wider theistic framework. Most people I think arguing for that viewpoint are already religious. But rather than ask you about that specifically, I'm curious if you see any connection between substance dualism, your substance dualism, and ethical intuitionism. Are there any reinforcing lines between them, or are they entirely independent in your thinking?
Yeah, so I have this collection of controversial views. There's substance dualism. I believe in libertarian free will. I believe in moral realism, rationalism and epistemology, and I think there's more that I was going to say. And Platonism, of course. All right. There's some connection. I don't know. I feel like these go together. I feel like if you believe in uh, you might call the soul, right? If you believe in the soul as a non-physical entity, then it seems more plausible that it could grasp these abstract objects that are also non-physical. Um, to, but I don't have that much to say about how that works or something, but it just seems more plausible. If there are moral properties, there are objective moral properties. That sort of seems to me to go together with there being minds that are not just physical. If there's just the physical world, on the face of it, it's hard to see how value fits into that, and it's also hard to see how consciousness fits into that. Um, so I don't know, and you might think like if there's one non-physical thing, then it's more likely that there are others. So if there's
Okay,
value, it's
but
more
only
likely.
these like really general sorts of connections. It's not like you see the soul as providing the key facet that underwrites intuition or something like that.
Well, I mean, like intuition is a capacity of your mind. It's not a capacity that purely physical objects have, right? So so in some sense they're connected. Also, it's sort of like, well, the things that are the ultimate bearers of value have something to do with consciousness. Like conscious beings have value, but inanimate objects don't, or they don't have intrinsic value by themselves, I think. So there's some connection there.
Okay. Well, you've rattled off a number of views that I agree with, so I think you and I would have a lot in common. And I'd love to have you on again to talk about some of those other issues. But
Yeah.
for today, I think this was a very substantive conversation. It'll leave me with a lot to think about. So I appreciate you coming on the show today. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Thanks for having me. It was great talking to you.